Good morning, everyone. We will be, what do they say? A picture is worth 1,000 words. We'll be looking at some of the halachos involved in pictures, as well as some recent conversations about the propriety or impropriety of certain types of pictures, pictures overall from a Jewish perspective, as well as a recent conversation about Shidduch pictures for matchmaking purposes. And actually started thinking about this subject back in August. Source number one, it was an article in the Associated Press. The Taliban published vice laws that ban women's voices and bare faces in public. Afghanistan's Taliban rulers have issued a ban on women's voices and bare faces in public under new laws approved by the supreme leader in efforts to combat vice and promote virtue. Article 13 relates to women. It says it is mandatory for a woman to veil her body at all times in public, and that a face covering is essential to avoid temptation and tempting others. Clothing should not be thin, tight, or short. Women should veil themselves in front of all male strangers, including Muslims, and in front of all non-Muslims to avoid being corrupted. A woman's voice is deemed intimate and so should not be heard singing, reciting, or reading aloud in public. It is forbidden for women to look at men they are not related to by blood or marriage, and vice versa. How to enforce that or determine whether they're doing so or not sure. Article 17 bans the publication of images of living beings threatening an already fragile Afghan media landscape, right? How do you have news if you don't have newscasters on TV, at least? Article 19 bans the playing of music, the transportation of solo female travelers, and the mixing of men and women who are not related to each other. The law also obliges passengers and drivers to perform prayers at designated times. I know you're thinking what I'm thinking. Glad you don't live in Afghanistan. So, according to the ministry website, the promotion of virtue includes prayer, aligning the character and behavior of Muslims with Islamic law, encouraging women to wear the hijab, inviting people to comply with the 5 pillars of Islam. It also says the elimination of vice involves prohibiting people from doing things prohibited by Islamic law. Right? A theocracy, not surprising, and of course, certain aspects of modesty have similarities in Jewish law as well. We've touched on some of them, but this seems to be going, much further, both in terms of we talk about this idea of women not being allowed to look at men, also the idea of images and faces being banned from being publicized. Right, now I know why people are not showing their faces on Zoom. They're very machmir on that. Those of the rest of us hopefully are not going to pay too high a spiritual price. But in general, pictures are part of the. I think we spoke about this Sukkot time with decorations. We spoke about this at other times. Images are not something that are foreign from the Jewish religious realm. As well as having certain spiritual desirability. Source number 2 is a blurb from Time magazine a long time ago, 1989. Hey, I'll trade you a Ruderman for a Feinstein. No, this is not a proposed baseball card swap, but the kind of deal that might occur among children with a religious bent, trading rabbi cards. Since they were introduced last August, more than 400,000 have been sold at 20 cents a piece, or 99 cents for a pack of 5. On the back of each 4-inch by 6-inch card, printed in English and Hebrew, the rabbi's dates of birth and death, the books he published, and details about his life. Right, this was a very popular episode. I remember the cars. I actually had both a Ruderman and a Feinstein. There's an article written by Zev Elef, Jewish historian, president of Gratz College a couple of years ago in Lair House, where he talks a lot about this phenomenon. It is how the first edition had mainly those from the more yeshivish institutions. The second edition added some YU rabbis. I remember in 1989 at the time. Some of the names that we talk about at YU today were not necessarily as prominent or widely known, but the quote unquote rabbi cars from Yeshiva University were Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik. At this time, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, was already retired from active teaching at YU, and the other one was Rabbi David Lifshitz, who was and the two of them were both more. From the more yeshivish cadre of YU yeshiva heads at the time. Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik also led the yeshiva in Brisk in Chicago. Rabbi David Lifshitz was the president of the Ezras Torah organization, charitable organization, the ones who make the little luachs. so had a certain more of a prominence in the broader, yeshiva world. In any event, the idea of being inspired by Rebbe pictures. We all know you go into a Chabad house, everyone there's a picture staring down of the Rebbe staring down at you. You go to Judaica stores, it's fairly common to see portraits of rabbis available for purchase. How does this what about any type of religious hesitation? And just like in Islam, there is that hesitation or an even prohibition, Judaism has something similar. It actually comes from last week's Parsha, when we read after the Ten Commandments, source number 3, Lo sasuni ti Elohei chesef Elohei zahav lo sasu lachem. With me, therefore, you shall not make any gods of silver, nor shall you make for yourself any gods of gold. Right? Here, the word Elohei is not a Kodesh word. It's not sacred. It's not talking about God. It's talking about gods. It's talking about idolatry. And the aftermath of the Ten Commandments, what I call the epilogue to the Decalogue, includes this idea of not having any gods of silver. Now, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah makes use of a well-known Talmudic technique when it talks about what does this mean? You shall not make. So you obviously should have idols. We don't have idolatry. So why is it taught that figures of all faces are permitted except the human face? There was a discussion about what types of figures are allowed and not allowed, and they say that figures can be made, but not the human face. Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rabbi Yoshua, said, I heard in the name of Rabbi Yoshua that there's a different reason why one may not fashion a figure of a human face. The first states, you shall not make with me, lo sasun iti. This can be read as, you shall not make me. You shall not make lo tasun oti. You can't make me, right? Remember, in the Torah, you don't have the vowels there. So et and ot can be spelled the same way. So not the idea of you shall not have along with me idolatry, you shall not make a picture of me. What do you mean a picture of God? But since the human being was created in the image of God, right? Tselem Elohim barat ha'adam, it's prohibited to fashion an image of a human being, but fashioning figures of other attendants of God is permitted. Right? So the idea, you're not allowed to make a picture because you can't make a picture OT of God, even though we read the word ET. And people are creating the image of God. So, it doesn't say you shall not paint pictures of man. We're learning it from the revocalization of the word ET to OT, and the fact that humans are created in the image of God. And so therefore, we're taking it one step beyond. You're not allowed to have images. You're not allowed to make human images in human form. So this top page in Avodah Zarah 43b has a whole discussion about the constellations and what you're allowed to make, what you're not allowed to make. And remember, we know that idolatry is forbidden, and it's not surprising considering the fact that idolatry really is the antithesis of Judaism. It's spiritually toxic. Jewish law goes very far to keep people away from idolatry. So the rabbinic teachings on Avodah Zarah 43b are there to extend and keep us further and further away. If you have figurines, or if you have 3D, if you have replicas of human beings, then it might lead you to worship them. If it leads to if people worship the stars in the constellations, well, then having big posters of the constellations may become a temptation. So a lot of these things become forbidden. Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah 141 deals with this. He has a couple of those laws in source number 5. It is forbidden to depict forms found in divine abode, such as the four faces together, and likewise the forms of seraphim, ophanim, and ministering angels, as well as human form alone. Right. So this is an extension, but both of it quotes that teaching that we saw in source 4, as well as some of the other discussions there on Avodah Zarah 43. All of these are forbidden to make, even for decoration. If a Gentile made them for him, it's forbidden to keep them. Right? This is considered an extension of idolatry, even if it's not worshipped, and it has to be avoided. The gloss, this is Rabbi Moshe Isserlis chiming in. However, if one finds them, they are permitted, except for the sun and the moon, which idol worshippers commonly serve, or if there is evidence that they were made for worship. Then they are forbidden like all other images, as explained in the beginning of the section. So the Ramah always puts a bit of a crack in the facade of prohibition, that you find something, you're not sure it's worship, that might be permissible. Again, he's not encouraging this, but there's like I said, a crack in the facade. Shulchan Aruch continues, in what cases this sit? Only when they are protruding, right? It has to be bolate. It has to have, it's not enough to just be two-dimensional. There has to be a three-dimensional. But if they are recessed in, such as those woven into the fabric or painted on a wall with dyes, it is permitted to make them. As for the images of the sun, the moon, and the stars, they are forbidden, whether protruding or recessed. They have a problem with the constellations. If they are for learning purposes to understand and teach, all are permitted, even if protruding. But if there's a reason to study them, like the Mishnah records rabbis having pictures of the moon and the sun and the stars in order to figure out when the new moon is seen and how it's seen to be able to understand Rosh Chodesh. So that is permitted as well if it's for learning purposes. And some permit them in a public place where there is no suspicion. Right? The Ramah mentions, if there's no suspicion, it's kind of a very terse statement, which seems to be discussing the idea that if they're not worshipped, if you have no fear of them being worshipped, then it's also not problematic. Shulchan Aruch continues in number 7 of 141. There are some who say that there's no prohibition with the form of man or a dragon unless it is a complete form with all its parts. Right? We talked about the Shulchan Avodah Zarah 43 said that there's a problem with creating human form, but they're saying now only if it's really like really like a statue, only if it's really like a full recreation. So there are those who say that's the issue. However, the form of the head of the body or the body without a head is no prohibition, not in finding it, nor in making it. And this is the common practice, right? So the Ramah adds, again, the Shulchan Aruch presents the difficulty. Ramah creates a little bit of a leniency being found, and the Ramah embraces the full leniency when it comes to not making the full form of a human being. Right? Dragon, more. Quoting the terminology of the Talmud, but the idea of any types of changes, where if it's only the head or the body without the head, it's not a problem, and the Ramah embraces this. This is the common practice, and so it seems that we moved away from the concern. And a lot of this, this is mentioned by Rabbi Avram Danzig in his Chachmas Adam, that the idolatrous worship ain't what it used to be. And the implementation of Jewish law allows for certain allowances, especially when things are not as idolatrous as they used to be. Some are still very concerned. I still remember there's a book called All for the Boss. It's about Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Herman, Orthodox Jew in the early part of the 20th century. It's written by his granddaughter Ruchama Shein, who records that when they got a doll, her father smashed the face in a little bit because it was a doll and it's a face and it's 3D, and not everyone is as strict as that. But we see where that idea comes from and how it can be implemented. Again, Rabbi Danzig seems to start saying there's a pivot once things are less idolatrous. He's writing in the late 18th century. And beginning to notice that along the lines of what we see even the Ramah jumping on in terms of if it's not idolatrous and if you're not sure, then we can permit it, and this becomes the common practice and the like. As photography becomes introduced, how does that fit in with this? I think that based on how the Ramah comments in source number 5, as well as mentioning the Chai Adam. And things not being used as idolatrous as kind of more of an acceptance of these types of images. Photography, especially if they're selling in all these, very religious stores of very religious individuals, so we can assume that it's permissible. But how did it come to that? So Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch addresses this in source number 6 in one of his responsa, and he begins, so there in the Hebrew, we'll translate. He begins by talking about that the Asiyas Suras Adam Asura Fil Lanoi. He begins pointing out the strict view of the Shulchan Aruch that you're not supposed to have human form, and he quotes the idea of he quotes the Gemara that we quoted, Avodah Zarah 43, that the Shach quotes, and the Ramah, and he quotes the Yesh Misha Matir, the bottom paragraph of source number 5, as also being possible, and he says that this is the ikar for halacha. And then he says that goes on to say that mihu, this is the 4th line, right? He says that nowadays it's not idolatrous. It's okay for non-Jews to make these images. We don't have to fear that it's idolatry. You know, so he quotes Ayin Sham b'chachmas Adam. He quotes Rabbi Danzig, as we mentioned. Now, you know, he's addressing the idea of museums, visiting museums, because museums are full of these types of things, whether they be, you know, forms, statues, images. So he talks about miyu kansha Yehudi hu sha'asa kama me'atzuras v'sham nasu b'tzura shlema. He says that this is not something a Jew should make. If it's a Jew made it, then it's forbidden. And Yeshlo Makim Shanasa Lachazusa Sharab Yireu Lehanasivenu Nasa Lemisha Asa Bishvila Lahanu Lachola Balavaka Museum. Museum is how it's written out in the Hebrew. He says since a Jew made it for people to see it, it's prohibited for the Jew and for those who made it for, and it should be problematic. And he compares this to when prohibited activity is done on Shabbos. Right, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos, but let's say a Jew cooks on Shabbos, so that Jew can never, according to Jewish law, can never eat that food. You know, and so it's a similar. He wants to draw an analogous situation here, and then he continues in after the three dots. He says those restrictive views, those stringent views about visiting the museums has to do with Jewish art. And if you know it's made by a Jew, that's when they said you're not supposed to view these images because according to the stricter opinion, right? And acknowledges that there's the leading opinion, but according to that stricter opinion, that viewpoint extends into viewing that artwork made by Jews held in museums if you're going to go down that path. But he then again continues that Amnam al piso kol riya b'dvar masurim pogen b'nefesh. He says, leaving aside the halachic issue, there's a spiritual side, and that looking at images is harmful to the soul. If you look at images of human beings that were made in a way that goes against the prohibited view in Jewish law, it hurts the soul. Even permissible images of human beings that are made that you could look at, alul lahazik, it can cause damage. So he's going beyond. He said he pointed out the halachic discussion that we had. He points out that for a Jew to be engaged in this, in the creation of these more problematic forms and images, could be restrictive, and there's a more restrictive view that can be taken that would prohibit this and prohibit looking at this. And then he moves beyond the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, quite literally, involves spiritual harm that comes from looking at these pictures. And certainly for children, you should be concerned about their spiritual development and their soul and avoid them looking at this. And then he continues, it's interesting, he calls it the prohibition to create images of human beings. He quotes the Ramban, who takes a more prohibited, restrictive view. Right? That could be problematic even for a camera. Many tzaddikim, righteous people who were careful and they did not want pictures taken about them because of this damage. Even though they were strict for themselves, that any types of images, even if they were not three-dimensional, even if they were just a flat two-dimensional surface, it's prohibited. They didn't mind if other people took their picture. Because it says that you're not allowed to make. Well, when you push the button on the camera, you're not making any picture. What are you doing? You're causing it. It's grama, it's indirect. You're starting a process that creates the final product, but you're not making it itself. So, Rav Sternbuch clearly is quoting some of the more restrictive voices, the idea of spiritual damage coming from any types of images, but also opens up the reason why photography is permissible. There's the more lenient approach of Jewish law in the first place, and the fact that taking pictures is not doing anything, it's the process that gets the doing done, it's grama, and it could be allowed. Ukvar nagu kol Yisrael lahakel bazeh. All of Israel is lenient. U'tzalem b'nei adam, and the often it's yilum nasa kein grama, to make the way the picture is taken by pushing the button. Shemasir hamonea hakisui, right? Because the way you push the button, it lifts up the cover over the lens. Below havamasa b'yadayim sha'asu is not actual activity, which is where the prohibition is. Gam ein bo mamish. Right, I'm not sure especially if you talk about digital cameras, there's no object, there's no film, there's no anything, so again, clearly, and he invoked it before as well. Certainly, once we moved away from idolatry, a lot of this has become more open and more permissible, or ability to be lenient, and certainly when it comes to the way of photography. V'yechidei segula levad, just certain special individuals. And they're very careful for piety reasons to refuse to be photographed. Also, these has nothing to do with the creation of images. It has to do with the spiritual damage. It has nothing to do with the potential problematic idolatrous related prohibition. It's quote unquote only spiritual or Kabbalah. And then he says there are those who say that you're allowed to take pictures and to hang up pictures of the righteous, that you can be reminded of them and be inspired by their ways. The Nahara Upashte, which is the rabbinic terminology of that they're different sides of the river, different flows, and and choose one. He's not weighing in whether you should have Rebbe pictures or you shouldn't have Rebbe pictures. He's just saying that it is permissible. So there's sometimes you'll notice when looking at the different types of pictures that are for sale of different rabbis. Sometimes the rabbis are smiling for the camera, and sometimes the rabbis are looking at the camera. And sometimes it has to do with whether that rabbi's personal preference was to be photographed or not to be photographed. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, who was a rabbi in Posek in Memphis for many years, raises the issue: are you allowed to take a picture of a rabbi who doesn't want to have his picture taken? Right? Is that it enters into a little bit of the intellectual property discussion? But I don't want my picture taken. Can you take my picture? And he points out that there is this machlokes, so certain rabbis say no, they're not in control of their image, right? Your face is the public domain that everyone can see you. So unless, like Islam in Afghanistan, they're demanding from religious purposes to have it covered, then it's there for the taking, as long as you don't make any money off of someone's image without their permission. Others say, no, it's their personal property. And, because of the issue that they may not want to be photographed for religious reasons, whether it be halachic or spiritual, you're not allowed to take their picture. And it seems that, within the Torah observant world, you have, as Rabbi Sternbuch concludes, Nahara Upashte, people going into different sides. Questions or comments before we move into some of the other issues that were raised, both in terms of gazing at pictures, which seems to be a problem, which is why in Afghanistan they covered everything over, as well as the Shidduch picture conversation.
Yeah, so fortunately, when I was on vacation a couple of years ago in Italy, the statue of David has his arms cut off, so I'm okay there, I guess.
It's very, very religious.
Yes, exactly. So, but in regard to the camera, I mean, when you're walking around in Mei Sha'arim, you have to be careful of not taking pictures, because there are the Haredim, some of the Haredim, they're very against not only you taking pictures of them. I wonder if I'm sure that's connected to this. It's really an interesting phenomenon, and how we kind of travel between the black and white old school halacha versus modern times, how we view these things. I always find that interesting, how we kind of
look. You see its development. The Gemara is having a conversation. I think you see the possibility of going into both of these directions, because the Gemara is never saying it's prohibited because usually the Torah tells us something, so it's either yes or no. So the rabbis sometimes have a gezerah d'Rabbanan, they'll make a rabbinic rule, yes or no. Here they're saying it's based upon an ETOT, right? So it's already indirectly an issue in the larger issue of idolatry, which has lots of regulations to keep us away from it. And so as it proceeds, there always seems to be, you see the Ramah grasping on cracks in the facade of prohibition, Chachmas Adam opening things up when it's not idolatrous. You see a more contemporary review of or approach to halacha. Rav Sternbuch quotes it all, as is his style in many things is somewhat stringent. When it comes to the cameras and photography, opens it up completely and says that seems to be the practice. Worry about the spiritual side of things, and I think it really will pivot over into what the role of pictures plays within society. What are you looking at pictures for, right? We're worried mostly about idolatry, but really in the contemporary times, and even halacha recognizes, without idolatry as popular as it used to be, the prohibitions of images and the like are less difficult, and certainly photography is permissible. But what about what it's used for? And that's where we get into this idea of Jewish law is concerned with certain types of untoward thoughts or lust or inappropriate, leading to inappropriate or improper sexual dalliances and relationships, and that also enters into the realm of photography in particular. And part of that is the extreme modesty rules and regulations that you see. We saw it in the case in Afghanistan, or full head to toe burqas. We see that in some the sections of the Jewish community institutes that takes that forward. Right, certainly staying completely closed off from everything else, cover yourself from head to toe, keep your eyes and ears closed, never open up your mouth, right? That's how you can certainly guarantee acting the wrong way, right? But that's generally not what we're doing. We're commanded to be out there. You have to be on the lookout for ways to help people. You have to say things that are helpful. The idea, shevi al tasa adif, is an expression we find in Jewish law. If you're not sure what to do nothing. But that's not to violate something, but that's not an approach to life as a whole. And we covered so far the idolatrous concern of the images, the concern it seems to have obviated somewhat. Photography, okay, there's still this spiritual idea. It's almost the idea that if someone takes your picture, they're taking a piece of your soul or something like that. But from a halakhic perspective and a practice perspective, the act of the image is less the problem. What about what people are looking at? And that we see, there's a couple of psukim which start that conversation. One we see every day. This is the JPS translation, is you shall not follow your heart and eyes and your lustful urge. Right? The idea that the concern is not about looking around, it's about looking around and being led astray by improper sites that can lead you in a sexual direction, because that's generally the rabbinic conversation about this verse. And the other one is v'nishmartem mikol davara in Devarim 23:10, source number 8. Be on your guard against anything untoward. Right. So one is more specifically worried about the lust and what you see that will lead to improper activity. That can lead to improper sexual activity. And one is basically worry about everything, right? Sometimes you can't take this to the nishmar to be called davara. Could also mean never leave your front door, because you never know what. So there's clearly going to be a gradation. And when we look at some of the halachos and how this is understood, from the sexual perspective, brachos 24a, whoever looks for pleasure at a woman's little finger is like one who looks at her private parts. Right? This is the idea that this would seem to be a good source to fit into the article that we led off with. This is again, whoever looks for pleasure, the idea of starting to gaze, starting to think about where this will go. There's that concern of this very much is in a lustful way. This is what we're concerned about. Yalkut Shimoni was talking about when the people were looking at Shaul's beauty, and they couldn't get enough of him. That's what Rabbi Yehuda said. Rabbi Yossi said to him, so if so, you have equated daughters of Israel to prostitutes. What do you mean? They're gazing at him lustfully? What kind of behavior is that? Is it not the case that just as a man may not feast his eyes on a woman who is not fitting for him to marry, so too a woman may not feast her eyes on a man who is not hers? Right? It's not just men who have an issue; it's women who have an issue. If we're worried about, if we're worried about sexual urges and behavior that's untoward that comes from just starting by looking, then it's the same for men and for women. So you have the Brachos 24a, which is worried about men looking at women. And you have source number 10, which is worried about anybody looking at anybody because of the negative behavior that may lead to. And when we talk about halacha lamasa in terms of how this is understood from terms of behavior, look, everyone admits the quote unquote the lustful looking is at least that can go down a slippery slope of negative behavior is going to be wrong. But what about just general a glance or the like? And does it go both ways? Is it the same level? Did Chazal, our sages, have the same problem of women looking at men as they did of men looking at women? So Rabbi Avodia Yosef says they did not. Women are safer than men. Source number 11, we're not concerned about women ogling men, for they are not prone to physical effects. One can justify the practice to be lenient about this because the Yalkut Shimoni is not in accordance with the halacha. Right? The Yalkut Shimoni, source number 10, gave us the concern of women looking at men. But he says that's only a midrash, it's not halacha. The fundamental halacha is that I wrote to permit women looking freely at men. So even before we get to shidduch pictures, maybe the women can look at shidduch pictures of the men, but not the other way around. Doesn't seem to be where the issue is sociologically. Rav Adi Yosef says this idea of looking at faces is more a concern of men looking at women rather than women looking at men. Men looking at women, you got to worry about the little finger. Women looking at men, you don't have the same issue. Rabbi Shmuel Vosner, Shevet Halevi, source number 12 says, yeah, it's actually a problem both ways. One cannot deny that if women really look at men for the purpose of sexual pleasure, women transgress like men, right? You shall not stray after your hearts after your eyes. Lo tasiru. Doesn't say which one. It's a negative commandment. It applies equally to everyone. For women are obligated to negative commandments like men. If so, there's no doubt that the holy Tana Rabbi Yossi was correct, right? He's saying that the Yalkut Shimoni, Rabbi Yossi's view in source number 10, is correct. That a woman too should not feast her eyes on a man who is not her husband. But feasting her eyes is more than looking or just seeing, as the language indicates. But to just to see or to look at men without feasting their eyes, without sexual thoughts, as I see them regularly from the women's section of the synagogue, certainly we did not find that our forefathers and rabbis were concerned about that. So, Rabbi Avad Yosef might be looking specifically at this idea of gazing and feels that the rabbinic sources only indicated a problem for men to look at women, not women to look at men. Rabbi Vosner disagrees, but also makes it a bit of a larger conversation about appropriate behavior and says that in general, the kind of casual glancing and looking at each other and looking at people's faces or presence doesn't seem to be so much of an issue. And if it was a problem for women to look at men or even the other way around, right, everyone can see each other in the synagogue. It was actually, touches upon the men sitting separate from women. What's the issue? There are those that disagree with Rabbi Vosner and say that no, really, men and women in synagogue has to be that neither can see each other. Right? This is, sometimes when we talk about a mechitza separation, isn't there about being a physical partition and separation, or is it about people can't see each other? And for the most part, some form of separation is the more accepted view of mechitza, and that it's the more restrictive view that men can't see the women at all and women can't see the men. Going the other way around is a more restrictive view that seen mostly among the Hungarian poskim. But when you think about it, people say, "Oh, a balcony is the perfect mechitza because you don't have to worry about the size or the height of the partition." Wait a second, you can look up and see that. That's terrible. So on some level, it's very possible that a balcony can be zero mechitza, while a low partition is a mechitza. It just depends on from which side of the conversation a person is coming from. And so, but it seems that Rabbi Vosner is saying this is less about the trying to identify a prohibition of who's glancing at whom, rather than look, we know that the casual interaction or casual visualization is one thing, but anything that leads to inappropriate behavior is another. And that's how he concludes. Rabbi Adi Yosef is looking more at the narrow question of is there a prohibition of what's called histaklus, of gazing that go, from the men's side to the women's side. We have the Gemara in Brachos, so this is a prohibition. Do we have it going the other way? Rabbi Adi Yosef says no. Men can't look at women. Women can look at men. And Rabbi Vazir says, wait a second. It really goes both ways in terms of being concerned, because the concern really is more about how the visage is being looked at, worried about behavior on both sides, and not just specifically about the impact of of looking itself. Questions or comments, and then we'll talk a little bit about Shidduch pictures. Okay, so for the write-up of the Shidduch pictures, I went to a source related to me, an article my brother is writing for his Shul Bulletin, mostly because very little has been written about this, because it was at the most recent Agudath Israel convention back in November that this conversation took place. There's a recording of the conversation that took place between a number of rabbis about the Q&A, and the question was about Shidduch pictures. It made its way on social media. It has not made its way. I haven't seen an article written about it in any of the journals. It's not in Mishpacha magazine. It wasn't written up in the articles yet. The idea of Shidduch pictures has been discussed quite frequently over the last 10 years and more in media, and you can find articles about it. But at the most recent Agudath Israel convention, Rabbi Yisrael Reisman, Rosh Yeshiva of Torah of Das, was asked his opinion of the Shidduch resume photo. Rabbi Weissman said, I never tell a boy to marry a girl he doesn't like to look at unless he's Avram Avinu. But the whole idea of pictures, it's not a frum thing to do. He told a story of the mother who called him with his wife to inquire about a young woman as a potential shidduch for her son. Among the things she wanted to know was the girl's dress size. Rabbi Weissman responded by asking the mother what her dress size was. Okay, then. The mother said that's not a nice thing to ask a woman. Reisman went on to note that a relationship built primarily on externalities and what the boy is getting instead of what he's willing to give is doomed to failure. The Rebbes of Stolen have a tradition to avoid being photographed. We can understand why. A photo is only two-dimensional. Human beings are three-dimensional. We're supposed to admire, respect, and love three-dimensional beings. It can be problematic to be attracted merely by a two-dimensional photo. It is shallow and superficial to judge a human being based on a picture. At the same time, it is necessary and appropriate to be attracted to a person. But that attraction takes into consideration many factors, including personality, value, midot, and yes, appearances, never forgetting that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So, so that the Shidduch picture conversation seems to be that there's a lot of emphasis placed on the picture in the Shidduch scene. I would imagine those who live in this world where the only way of people coming together for a match or to go out is within the Shidduch framework, it's something that seems to be much more common, prevalent, and even acceptable. Many shadchanim, when they ask for the bio or what's called today the resume, want the picture also. I kind of, my reaction is, even before looking at some of these sources, that on some level, if someone feels that this is if someone goes to a shadchan to make a match and thinks that this boy and this girl might be good together, if you're relying on shidduchim to matchmaking and matchmakers, well, you'll find out what she looks like. No one's saying marry her. No one's saying to emulate the Love Is Blind show phenomenon. We're saying go out. You go there. You don't like what he or she looks like, then don't go out again. What has been lost. But it seems that there's a lot more emphasis in advance, a lot more concern in advance. Source 14, Rabbi Yair Hoffman, an article on this, like I said, about 9 years ago, quoted a couple of the rabbis from the yeshiva world, Rabbi David Feinstein. Why are we making things more difficult? There's a certain chen that young ladies have that often doesn't come across in a photograph. It can only be seen in person. We're making the Shidduch crisis worse with these new requirements. Rabbi Moshe Heinemann from Baltimore, I do not think that it is within the framework of tznius for a girl to give a picture out where others can possibly see it. This is not with the ruach of Torah. Having more of a problem with pictures being out there, more in the line of the spiritual element that Rav Sternbuch introduced. Rabbi Shmuel Fiors from Chicago, this was not the mahalech for Doros. This was not the approach of the previous generations. I think it's lacking in tznius and modesty. I don't think this is a proper hanhaga, a proper approach. And besides, a picture can be very deceiving. So it seems that it's something that's very frowned upon for a host of reasons, whether they be halachic or spiritual or bad advice, but still seems to be something. The bad habits are hard to break, or something like that. That it still seems to reverberate in the same conversations that are taking place 10 years later, even though there seems to be such a distaste for the pictures, even from some of the senior and leading rabbis of the communities that are are making use of shadchanim and shidduchim and the like. But the idea of the concern about tznius would seem to invoke some of what we talked about in terms of whether there's this histaklus issue, machlokas Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rav Vosner. Overall, I would tend to concur that I don't really get the picture piece, but again, it's not really my world, or have not been as involved in shidduchim of this type of level. Look, many, to me, it sounds a lot like, Hinge. You swipe right if you like what she looks like, or something like that. But, I think that hopefully our attention to details and to values and to proper behavior, hopefully that stands in the best merit for all those who want to be married to do so, picture or no picture. And, we should, I don't see the Taliban Afghan approach as having resonance or relevance for a healthy Jewish approach, although some of the issues that Islam addresses are certainly found in the Judaism, which they probably looked at. They took it to the extreme, and hopefully all of our actions be done with the appropriate attention, sensitivity to other people, and to what our values are all about.